What does a 9-year-old girl learn when she's watching her father's world collapse overnight? And what does she decide to do about it 20 years later with $200 million and the health of thousands of patients? This is not a story about fraud. Everyone's talking about the fraud. Fraud is what the courts called it. Fraud is what every headline called it, every news agent called it. Fraud is the word that lets us file it away as something unusual, something that happened to extraordinary people in a world that most of us will never inhabit. This is a story about something that happens every single day in boardrooms, in laboratories, in offices where people come to work knowing that something is wrong. There's a culture out there. There's a reputation even. Yet they say nothing because they have learned carefully and systematically one small lesson at a time that saying something is the most dangerous thing that they could do. This is a story, I believe, about what happens when a person who cannot tolerate the distance between what is a vision and reality and makes it everybody else's problem. And it doesn't start where you think. It doesn't start in Silicon Valley. It starts at a dinner table in Houston, Texas, where a teenage girl came home from school to find her father sitting in front of the telly, watching his whole world collapse on the news. By the end of this episode, you will, I would say, not just understand what Elizabeth Holmes did. You will understand and you will see how she learned to do what she did. And she learned that it was possible. And you will never look at the next big thing or the person performing it the same way again. Hey there, lovely people. Thanks for watching from wherever you are today. Quick favor before we get going, tap that like button, say hi in the comments, and of course, subscribe with the little bell so you don't miss anything. And if you're listening on Apple or Spotify, hit auto download so every new episode finds its way to you straight away. Let's dive in. Before we go there, let me tell you who I am and why I'm the person to take you into this. I analyze high-stakes performers and achievers, group dynamics, leadership, the psychology of toxic workplaces, and what they do to people inside of them. I've spent decades in clinical rooms with people who've lived inside systems exactly like the one Elizabeth Holmes built. Not at Theranos, not with $200 million at stake, but with the same architecture of fear, the same silencing of dissent, the same slow erosion of the ability to trust what you know to be true. The Theranos story has been told time and time and time again as a fraud story, as a Silicon Valley cautionary tale as such, as the rise and fall of a woman who fooled everyone. People focus on her. What has not been told, what nobody has told, is where it actually came from. Nobody's delved into that, but I will today. And what it reveals about the systems that enabled it, the people who were trapped inside of it. Well, I say trapped, but you will see what I mean by that. And, it's a self entrapment, really. And the dynamics that play out in workplaces, you know, every single day without a single headline being written. None of it makes the press. That is what this episode is. Everything that I'm about to tell you, everything that I'm about to show you about Theranos, the constructed reality, it was constructed, the silencing of witnesses. If you know anything about Theranos, you know that their witnesses were silenced. The punishment of people who tried to speak. I see versions of it every single week. I was going to say day, but week, I'll say, in workplaces that my clients come from. Different scale and, different stakes, but the same wound driving the same patterns. I have put together a toxic workplace recovery kit that breaks down exactly how these dynamics operate and what to do when you're inside of one. The link is in the description. Stay with me to the end of this video and I'll come back to it because what you're about to understand about Theranos, you're probably going to want it. Now, as I started my research on this, I was thinking back to that time whereby everyone was so focused on the emergence of tech. And every few years, as we know, something comes along that promises a change to everything, a new innovation, something to cure something, a new technology, a new company, a new name on the cover of a magazine that the whole world agrees is going to rewrite the rules of science, of psychology, of technology. We want it to be real. We hope and pray that it's real. We need that resurgence. We need that hope, that possibility. That hope is human. The possibilities are human. Progress is supposed to work that way. The next breakthrough is always coming. We just don't know when. So that's not being naive, really, because it's human. It is a story backed by centuries of evidence. We only need to look at the Ice Age and we can go on. Things that seemed impossible became real again and again and again. The polio vaccine was impossible, but it happened. The iPhone was just a dream, and then it happened. The mapping of the human genome was impossible. So when a young woman stood up in Silicon Valley and said, what if I could run 240 blood tests from a single drop of blood in minutes at a fraction of the current cost? The ears were perking up. Available to everyone, regardless of their financial circumstances. The response of the most intelligent, the most educated, the most accomplished, the most learned people wasn't skepticism. They didn't go back and say, hold on a second, young lady. It was recognition. Why has this not been done before? They were thinking. This is exactly the kind of thing that gets done. This is how progress happens. This is how progress works. This is how innovation works. That response, that completely reasonable, completely human, and I would also say completely understandable response was the vulnerability that Theranos was built to exploit. The Silicon Valley effect This is what I'm going to call it. It was the Silicon Valley effect. When two worlds were enough to understand how thoroughly that vulnerability was exploited, you do need to understand that there was a specific culture, a cultural moment in which Theranos emerged. It could not have emerged outside of this cultural movement and moment. So by the mid 2000s, Silicon Valley had produced, let's look at it, shall we? Apple, Microsoft, incredible. People who looked unconventional, I'll use that word, talked about changing the world. They dropped out of elite universities and they built things that actually did change the world. The cultural template was established and it was intoxicating. You did not need to understand the technology to feel its power. The track record of the unconventional visionary in that specific geography, Silicon Valley, was real enough that deference to it was not irrational. Jobs had been right. Gates had been right. Page and Brin had been right. And then in 2007, something happened that I believe, made Holmes's claims feel not just possible, plausible, but inevitable. Apple released the iPhone, the small device that actually did what Holmes was claiming her device would do for medicine. Take something complex and make it simple, make it accessible, make it carryable, personal, revolutionary, in your pocket right now. In 2007, Theranos' valuation hit $197 million. That's not a drop in the bucket. But then Apple released the iPhone. And the cultural context of this made it almost impossible to say that a small device could not revolutionize blood testing. After all, look what Jobs just did. And it worked. Because a small device had just revolutionized everything else. The two words Silicon Valley have become a category that suspended normal evaluative processes and otherwise what would have been rational people. I believe they were starstruck. And being starstruck is not a strong enough description, really. Investors, journalists, board members, employees, just being associated with Silicon Valley equaled innovation. It did something quite specific to their critical faculties. And I think this had a dent in their normal critical thinking. Just being in proximity to something like that was historic. I work at a medical startup in Silicon Valley that's going to change healthcare. You know, that would have been a moniker that everybody wanted to say. They would have introduced themselves in that way. Say that sentence and feel what it does. To the person saying it, feel what it does. To the person hearing it, feel what it does. That feeling, that star by association effect is not vanity. It's a deeply human response to the genuine achievements of a genuinely extraordinary place. Look what was coming out of Silicon Valley. So Holmes saw all of this, and I believe Holmes understood that effect with surgical precision. And she built a system designed to produce it in every person she needed to capture, because Holmes captured people. Now, here is where it gets interesting. As I researched, I was thinking, wait a second, what was Google doing around that time? So this is the one institution in the story whose response to Theranos deserves to be named specifically, because it demonstrates exactly what the critical distance that most people lacked would have produced. Google Ventures did not invest in Theranos. They didn't. Why? Why? You're asking. Because, and this, I was so excited when I found this. Their CEO explained, I think with precision that could serve as a thesis for this entire video. He described the difference between a portfolio company that scraps its technology after a double-blind test proves it does not work, as well as thought, and a case where you simply cannot tell what's going on and you just cross your fingers because it seems to have momentum and there's that starstruckness and that culture involved as well. But that distinction for me between genuine scientific failure treated as data and performed certainty treated as sufficient is the heart and soul of the Theranos story in one sentence. He also noted something that should have stopped everyone and every journalist covering Theranos cold. But of course, the journalists weren't interested. He said he could not find one reporter, not one journalist who had written about the revolution in blood testing who had actually gone and had the test done themselves. Incredible. Absolutely unbelievable. However, it supports my analysis. It supports my thesis. And I was saying, as I was researching this, ooh, I wonder what Google was thinking at the time. And boom, that came up. But you see, that's someone who still maintained critical thinking. So the cultural starstruckness was so complete that the most basic act of verification, which would have been go get the test, see if it works, did not even occur to the people whose professional purpose was to be skeptical. I thought journalists were meant to be skeptical, not because they were foolish, but because the performance was that complete. And you see, that's the thing. Silicon Valley runs on performance of certainty. Every founder is pitching a vision that does not yet fully exist. This is what we call testing. That culture is not inherently fraudulent. Most of the time, the product eventually works. Why? Because they test, they fail, they test again. Everything is used as data. But what made Theranos different was not the performance of certainty. It was what happened when the certainty was tested. They didn't like it. And people were fired because they questioned. In a genuine innovation environment, the moment your product fails a test is the most valuable moment in the entire process. Failure is data. I mean, we learned that in first year psychology. Failure is when science actually works. Theranos, for them, failure was existential even. I'm going to use that word, not because the technology was not ready yet, but because the person at the center of the company had built her entire identity, and I'll go into that a bit more, around the claim that it already worked. So when your hypothesis is a scientific proposition that you can test it, fail, and learn, that's when things start to work. When your hypothesis is your identity, though, failure is seen as an annihilation. That distinction is the heart of everything that follows. And to understand why Elizabeth Holmes could not tolerate the gap between vision and reality, you have to go back to a house in Houston and a father watching his world collapse on telly.
Clicking the subscribe button right now. Thank you for your support. You make this podcast possible. Now, back to the show.
Elizabeth Holmes was born in Washington, D.C. in 1984 into a family that carried the weight of a very specific kind of legacy. Her paternal great-great-grandfather was Charles Louis Fleischmann, a Hungarian Jewish immigrant who founded Fleischmann's Yeast and became one of the wealthiest men in America. What a legacy. Incredible. Her great-great-grandmother married Christian Holmes, a renowned surgeon, so respected that a hospital in Cincinnati was named after him. Now, try and live up to that. But by the time Elizabeth was born, that wealth was long gone. That wealth had disappeared. But the memory of it had not. A childhood family friend and neighbor, Joseph Fewes, described the Holmes family atmosphere as something that stopped me cold. He said her father had a real sense of entitlement in terms of the traditional importance of family. That's interesting. That it had sort of eroded over the years. I mean, that's a strong word. And that the seeds of Elizabeth's grandiose fantasy for her business connected directly to what he called a paradise lost family mythology. So we know there was that myth about Fleischmann. By the time Christian Holmes came up, that wealth was gone. Paradise lost family mythology. Hold that phrase for a moment, because Elizabeth Holmes did not grow up poor, but she grew up in a family that remembered being rich. So hold that thought. That family told the stories of greatness, possibilities, that measured the present against the past, and it could not recover from the past. And it placed on its children, on Elizabeth specifically, what I think is a very unspoken expectation that someone in this family needed to restore what had been lost. Elizabeth herself acknowledged this in a 2014 New Yorker profile. She said, "I grew up with those stories about greatness and about people deciding not to spend their lives on something purposeful, and what happens to them when they make that choice, the impact on character and quality of life." That is a loaded statement, and it's a reflection of who she is inside. The family moved a lot, and when Elizabeth was 9, her father's new job in Texas uprooted them again. So she knew that he felt guilty. She wrote him a letter, and the letter read, "What I really want out of life is to discover something new, something that mankind did not know was possible to do. Age 9. Age 9. The ambition was already there because that's where she got it from. Already world changing in its register. That's how that letter registers. World changing. Already shaped by the family mythology of greatness and riches, but also of greatness lost and waiting to be reclaimed. So who was going to reclaim it in that family? And then Houston happened. The dinner table in Houston where Christian Holmes IV, Elizabeth's father, was at the time vice president of the Clean Energy Solutions Group at Enron, a division built around the promise of innovative technology solving complex environmental problems. Do you see the thread? A mission statement that read, wait for it, optimizing environmental compliance through innovative technology. The parallels cannot be missed. Notice that mission statement. Innovative technology, environmental impact, making complex systems simpler and more accessible. That's a direct lift for Theranos. Read it again and tell me that it does not sound like it could have been written by his daughter 20 years later. And here's where it gets really interesting. In 2001, Enron collapsed. The company that Fortune magazine had named the most innovative in America for 6 consecutive years, you see the mythology, revealed to be built on constructed accounts. Okay, hear this, please, hear this. Manipulated markets and a culture organized around the performance of success so thoroughly that the people inside it had lost the ability to distinguish the performance from the reality. Christian Holmes lost his job. He lost his financial security. And according to a documented account from the family friend, Richard Fewers, when Christian Holmes came back to Washington after Enron failed, he was broke and he came crying to them for help. He'd lost it all. The Dropout, the Hulu series based on Holmes's story, portrays a very specific moment when Elizabeth, as a teenager, came home from school to find her father sitting in front of the telly, watching the news of Enron's collapse. That must have been devastating for not just him, but for her. And there's one other detail that deepens this picture further. But I want you to see how paralleled this is. Holmes's first investors were not strangers. They were her father's people. Tim Draper, the father of her childhood friend and next-door neighbor. Victor Palmieri, one of her father's long-term friends. Very first money Theranos ever raised came from Christian Holmes's personal network. And so I would say that the inheritance was not just psychological, it was financial. Her father's connections were the very first door she walked through. Two conclusions were available to her after watching him fall, though, because this is how her psychology would have worked. So the first conclusion would have been what Enron did was wrong. That's a possibility, one conclusion. The performance of innovation without the substance of it causes real harm to people. The gap between what a company claims and what it actually does eventually closes. That gap closes. And when it does, everything collapses because there's no foundation. There's no longer a foundation. And I would say the second conclusion would be my father's mistake was not the constructed reality. His mistake is that he did not control it tightly enough. He was inside someone else's system. Next time, build it yourself. Control every variable. Leave nothing to chance. And make sure the performance is so complete, so total, so convincing that no gap is ever visible. And if anyone even alludes to a gap, they're out. Elizabeth Holmes drew the second conclusion. Theranos was not built in spite of watching Enron collapse. It was built in response to it.
Let's pause for a moment from the show. And if you're enjoying today's episode of the Inquisitive Room podcast, we truly love your support. Leaving a 5-star review, hitting the like button, and subscribing on your favorite platform not only helps us grow, it ensures that you never miss an inspiring conversation. A word or two from you means the world, more than you know. They spark new, fresh ideas, connect us with incredible guests, and keeps the energy flowing. And if you're ready to go deeper, join our exclusive subscription service, where you'll gain access to bonus content, guided meditations, healing tools, and more to support your personal journey. Whether you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, watching on YouTube, or tuning in elsewhere, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments and help spread the word. Subscribe now to never miss an episode of deep dives into spirituality, philosophy, psychology, and personal growth. Together, we're building a conscious community that celebrates curiosity, transformation, and growth. Thank you for being a part of the journey. Now, let's dive back into today's episode.
After Enron, Christian Holmes did not go back to corporate life. He just rebuilt himself through genuine public service, disaster relief, the Environmental Protection Agency. He focused on public service, water coordination for developing nations. So somewhere inside of him, he wanted to help. He spent the rest of his professional life doing real work, difficult, unglamorous, genuinely impactful work for people who needed it. Although I did read in Kararu's book that he didn't like animals, which frightens me. Elizabeth Holmes grew up watching that too. She told CNN in 2014, my father worked in disaster relief, and so I grew up in a house that had pictures of these little children in really rough parts of the world. I was absolutely convinced that it was what I wanted to do. Then when I started realizing that a company could be a vehicle, I'm reading this, by the way, that a company could be a vehicle for having very direct impact over change, I started thinking about what I could build that could impact a lot of people's lives. So she was impacted by what her father did on both sides of his career. And the humanitarian mission at the heart of Theranos democratizing healthcare, giving everyone access to diagnostics, the pictures of children that filled her pitch decks, was not invented from nothing. That's where she got it from. Her father. It was her father's actual values. The values he developed in the wreckage of Enron. Stolen, though, and performed as moral cover for the same kind of reality distortion that had destroyed him in the first place. And then, because this story does not stop being devastating, I'm afraid. And then Elizabeth convinced her parents to invest their retirement savings in Theranos. The parents whose world collapsed at Enron gave everything they had left to their daughter's version of the same dream. But before all of that, before the company, before the investors, before the board, there was a moment at Stanford that nobody covers in quite the way it deserves, I believe. Elizabeth Holmes was dropping out. She was 19 and she had decided she was going to build a company instead of finishing her degree. Now, you could say because everybody else had done the same thing. All of her mentors, the people she would have been watching. Her father threw a paper airplane at her with the word PhD written on it, and she rejected it. That paper airplane is the thesis of this entire video in a single image. A father who had learned the hardest possible way, that performance without substance collapses, asking his daughter to complete a PhD playfully with the airplane to do the real work, pretty much. Do the real work. To build something through legitimate, rigorous, patent, and patient means. Now, there's a whole issue about the patent, but we're not going to be able to cover that. To earn the credential that represents everything Enron had not and was not. She rejected it. She was going to build something bigger. She wanted to make money, were her words, by all accounts. Faster, by whatever means necessary. The high expectations were there. She'd learned them. The family mythology was there. They needed to restore paradise lost. She was going to meet those expectations. The world is still paying for that decision. So some of you may be saying, well, you can't blame her father. He seemed like a decent man. He does. By all accounts, Christian Holmes is a decent man who rebuilt his life after a very significant failure, and he has stood by his daughter throughout everything. That's a father. Nothing in this analysis blames him for what Elizabeth did. What it observes is that she grew up inside a very specific set of lessons about power, about legacy, about collapse, and about reconstruction. And that those lessons shaped the architecture of everything she subsequently built. Understanding origin is not the same as assigning blame. So I'm not blaming her father. The court handled the consequences. This video handles the origins. That's it. Holmes bills herself before she bills anything else. Before Elizabeth Holmes could capture anyone else, she had to build the instrument of capture. The voice was wrong. Holmes spoke in a register significantly lower than her natural voice, deliberately, consistently, not occasionally, not in professional settings, but always. So this was a part of her moniker. Former employees and associates confirmed that the voice was constructed, a character that she inhabited so completely, so fully, that it became indistinguishable from her actual self. So I'm not here to diagnose her. And the lowered voice, by other people's testimonies, is almost universally framed as coverage of Holmes as a woman's attempt to be taken seriously in a male-dominated industry. I tend to have a different take on that. So that framing for me is far too generous. It's far too simple. The lowered voice was not compensation. It was construction. Holmes was building a character whose vocal signature communicated authority, certainty, and gravitas. That her actual voice, for young, female, uncertain, would not have conveyed to the specific audience that she was performing for. And it was a performance. And I'm going to touch upon the area that most people do cover, but again, I've got a slightly different take. The second instrument that she used was a bit more subtle and more psychologically precise, though. Holmes maintained eye contact with an intensity that often violated the normal microsocial contract of human interaction. All of this is unwritten, It's how we communicate. So the blinking rhythm that regulates the natural exchange between two people, the small involuntary signals that say, I'm here, I'm present, I'm human, I'm listening, I am negotiating this space with you, was absent. And most people who experienced this, who encountered her, could not identify why it unsettled them. They experienced it as depth. She was so deep, so intense. As intensity, as the quality of someone who's seeing something that others cannot. As though the certainty behind her eyes was so total that ordinary human nervous system regulation, my specialty, simply did not apply to her. That misattribution discomfort, experienced as depth, was doing enormous work in every Holmes's interaction on record. Watch the documentary footage of Holmes in interviews and presentations with this understanding, and you'll see it immediately. The stillness is not confidence at all. It is purely performance. And the performance is so technically accomplished that distinguishing it from the real thing required exactly the kind of clinical distance that her audiences had no reason to bring to a meeting with a visionary founder. The third element here, and most sophisticated, I might say, the most sophisticated instrument was what I am going to call identity hijacking. Now, I talk about this a lot in my work. This is my phrase. Steve Jobs spent 30 years building an iconography so powerful, so culturally legible that the black turtleneck had ceased to be clothing anymore. It became a signifier for him. It meant visionary, unconventional, right when everyone said wrong, vindicated by history, ahead of his time, too far ahead to be evaluated by ordinary metrics. Holmes adopted that signifier not because she admired Jobs, because I think she was envious of him. Though she clearly did admire him, but because she needed to borrow what it meant without having to earn it, she just did it. The turtleneck was a shortcut through 30 years of cultural meaning he had that she had not accumulated and could not have accumulated at 19 years old in any other way but to copy someone else's. This is identity hijacking. And it does go back to the association thing, whereby as long as you're in proximity and associated. So it's not stealing someone's identity, but it's stealing the meaning their identity had accrued. Wearing it as your own collateral. Activating a cognitive shortcut without triggering the conscious recognition that would have made people examine the borrowing critically. It worked because it operated below the threshold of conscious processing. And Theranos banked on that exactly. That everything was seen as what it was not. And everything that was seen as not. Nobody sat in a board meeting thinking, oh, she's dressed like Jobs, therefore she must be a visionary. They just felt the accumulated cultural weight of that iconography without being able to identify, where the feeling was coming from. Nobody could ascertain why they noticed it, but they couldn't work it out. That is extraordinarily sophisticated psychological manipulation. Here's the crucial difference that, I'm going to say it, most coverage of Holmes misses entirely. Jobs' reality distortion field was in service of products that actually worked. The iPhone was real. The Mac was real. The reality distortion was the means. The product was the end. For Holmes, the reality distortion was the product. There was nothing behind it that worked. That is the distinction between a difficult genius and a fraud. And it is the distinction that the board, the investors, the journalists, and the patients had no framework to make because the performance was so complete that the gap between means and end was invisible until it was not. So some of you may say, well, lots of people wear black turtlenecks. I mean, I do as well. I love a black turtleneck. The turtleneck alone would be a stretch. What makes it identity hijacking rather than fashion choice, fashion police, is the totality of the performance. The voice, the non-blinking, the dropout mythology, the reality distortion field, the specific language of visionary certainty, and yes, the turtleneck. All deployed simultaneously, and the consistency towards the same end. So separately, any single element could be coincidental. It could be seen as a coincidence. But the complete package, maintained for years in every context, is something else entirely. Now, there is in fact a fourth element, a fourth instrument here that deserves recognition and discussion because it does reveal something about what was underneath the performance, that the performance was designed to actually conceal. So John Carreyrou documented a very specific incident that those who witnessed it actually never forgot. When Holmes was challenged directly about the machines not working and other aspects of the technology, when someone in the room said the technology is failing, she did not engage with substance, with interest of the challenge, with curiosity of the challenge. She did not ask questions. She didn't request data. She told the person that they were not a team player and that they needed to leave, literally leave that moment, that instant, that second. Multiple accounts from people who were in rooms with Holmes under pressure describes the exact same thing. A sudden shift in register, in how she looked, how she moved, the performed warmth and certainty replaced instantaneously by something much colder, much darker, much more frightening, much more like Balwani. And we'll come to that. As if a different person had briefly surfaced before the performance reasserted itself. And that moment, that rage response to challenge, is the most clinically revealing thing Holmes ever did in a professional setting, because it tells you precisely what the performance was protecting. Not a vision, not a company, an identity so fragile that a single direct challenge to the technology felt like an existential threat that had to be eliminated immediately. Anyone raising concern was not wrong. They were dangerous. And the distinction between wrong and dangerous is the most important line in the psychology of toxic leadership. It's the line between someone who cannot hear criticism and someone who actively punishes it. Holmes was on the second side of that line. And it's very unfortunate. And so acquiring the operational instrument, Balwani, Holmes needed someone between herself and the operational reality of the company that she was building. Someone who would manage the objections, the laboratory, manage the employees, manage the challenges, manage the daily documented accumulating evidence that the technology did not work, which is what they were meant to do. It's science. So that she could maintain the purity of her performed certainty without having to directly confront what was really happening in the building that she owned, without having to look at it too closely. She didn't want to see it. She knew. So she also needed someone who could bark louder than she could, because she could bark. Make no mistake. That stare is a bark. That voice is a bark. The rage response that we just discussed was real, and it was witnessed by loads of people. But it was a disruption to the performance. It wasn't her baseline, you see. It was the moment the mask slipped. Holmes needed someone who could maintain the internal atmosphere of fear, of control, without requiring the mask to slip at all. She found that person in Ramesh Balwani, who was known as Sunny, and Balwani was 37 years old when he met her. She was 19. He had money, significant money by all accounts. He made it in the tech boom in the late 90s. So he had operational prowess, experience. He had recently left his marriage. He was an older man to her 19-year-old self. And he'd encountered Elizabeth at her, most vulnerable and innocent self. And he'd encountered in the 19-year-old Elizabeth Holmes something that produced in him exactly what it produced in most people who encountered her. Performed certainty up close. In a desire to be a part of it, he invested his own money like others did. He took a leadership role in the company, and his management style, described consistently by former employees as aggressive, overbearing, and temperamental, created inside Theranos exactly the atmosphere the system required. Fear. Don't ask questions, just perform. If you're not with us, you're against us. But I propose this, because a manager who frightens people into silence is functionally useful, but only to a company built on suppressing what the people inside it know. Holmes barked when sufficiently provoked. Balwani barked as his baseline. That was who he was. She was the face of the system. He was its immune response. Holmes faced outward toward the investors, the board members, the media, the patients, the cultural performance of visionary certainty. Balwani faced inward toward the laboratory, towards the employees, the daily reality of machines that did not work, and the people who knew it. And together, they created the complete system. The vision performed at the front. The reality suppressed at the back. Now, this was interesting. During the trial, Holmes accused Balwani of abuse. He and his ex-wife denied it. The truth of what happened between them privately may never be known. But what is documented in the consistent testimony of employees who worked under him, in John Carrew's reporting, in the trial record, is what his presence produced. Fear, silence, and the daily operational management of a gap between claimed reality and actual reality. And that grew wider with every passing month. If what you just heard resonated, and if you want to go deeper into the forensic psychology, the hidden dynamics, and the real stories behind high-stakes groups and toxic workplaces, become a subscriber on Apple Podcast and Spotify. Subscribers get ad-free episodes, bonus deep dives that do not make it to YouTube, and extended analysis that goes further than the video format allows. This is where the conversation continues and where the real work gets done. Join the inner circle and subscribe today on Apple Podcast or Spotify. The board was not foolish. It was targeted. Every analysis of the Theranos board reaches the same conclusion. How could such accomplished people be so comprehensively deceived? That question assumes the deception was general, that Holmes had a single pitch and the board fell for it. The deception was not general, really. It was surgical. Holmes understood with a precision that is itself remarkable that every powerful person has a very specific door, a specific history, a specific wound, a specific longing that makes them susceptible to a very specific kind of promise. She found those doors in each and every one of them, and she knocked on them individually with customized keys. But before the board, there was someone who came before all of them. And his story tells you everything about how the entire system was seeded. Don Lucas was a venture capitalist in his late 70s. And that's when he became one of Holmes's earliest and most devoted supporters. He was from a generation that had built Silicon Valley from the ground up. He had seen the unconventional vision proven right before. He believed in the template. He doted on Holmes as well, treated her by multiple accounts like a granddaughter. His emotional investment first in her was not primarily financial. It was personal. She had become for him, I would say, the living embodiment of everything he had spent years building. Everything he'd spent his career believing about visionary founders and patient capital and the importance of trusting people who see what others don't. So when evidence began to surface that the technology was not working, when Avi, a board member, who had done the work of rereading every document and he found discrepancies, he decided to take his findings to Don Lucas directly, hoping that he would see and help, but he showed him what he found. And Lucas agreed it could not be fixed with Holmes there. And then he did nothing about it. That moment is the group mind in its purest form. The evidence was seen. It was acknowledged. It was agreed upon. And then it was set aside. Because the relationship with Holmes was more real to Don Lucas than the data that Avi had placed in front of him. Avi eventually stood down and left his findings with Lucas, asking him to waive his own rights to shares in the company, a gesture that said everything about what Avi believed was coming. Lucas kept the papers and his shares. This is not a story about, a corrupt old man protecting a fraudulent company. It is a story about a man whose identity was so completely reorganized around his belief in Holmes that contradictory evidence couldn't even reach the part of him, critical thinking, that was capable of acting on it. That is the group mind, not agreement. The people who were investigated and removed, Avi and Anna, were not the only ones. They represented a category, The insiders who investigated, who did the work of reading the documents and comparing the claims to the results and finding the gaps. You really want those people on your board, on your side. The people who will spot the gaps, who brought what they found to the people above them through legitimate channels, and who were told in every case that their legitimate findings were a form of disloyalty. They weren't team players. They were acting in bad faith. Threaten them with legal action, the group mind, team player. It reframes the act of bringing accurate information to the people responsible for acting on it as a social failure rather than as a professional obligation. Now, by all accounts, Anna left, Avi left, others left. Pfizer came to examine the system and left. External validators who might have seen the gap were kept at a very carefully maintained distance. So each departure was managed and absorbed without changing anything. It's incredible because in a system organized around protecting the performance, the departure of a person who is seeing the reality is not a crisis. It's a solution. James Matisse was a 4-star Marine Corps general, so he had commanded troops in 2 Gulf Wars. This man had seen a lot. He'd watched soldiers die from wounds that might have been survivable with faster, more accessible battlefield diagnostics. So my take on this is that, this is a man who, because of his experience, what he's seen, Theranos would have been very inviting for him. Holmes was not selling him a technological company, a technology company. She was selling him the possibility of saving the kind lives he'd watched end in the field. Matisse did not just join the board for the fees. He invested his own money. It's documented, $85,000 of his own money. He said so himself under oath at Holmes's criminal trial in September 2021. Multiple contemporaneous reports from the Wall Street Journal, CBS News, AP, and the San Francisco Chronicle all reported the same amount from his courtroom testimony. This is not the behavior of a man who was, fooled by a slick presentation. It's the behavior of a man who genuinely believed. Because a promise had been delivered through the specific door that his entire life had built. Henry Kissinger famously said that power is the ultimate aphrodisiac. It's not surprising coming from him if you know his history. He was speaking abstractly. He was describing his own psychology, though, with unusual honesty. Kissinger was in his 80s when he joined the Theranos board. His entire adult life had been spent at the intersection of power and history. Holmes represented something he had encountered in quite that form. He knew women, but this was a young woman performing a quality of certainty, a quality of power that he found genuinely intoxicating. The board role was not due diligence. It was proximity to something that made him feel connected to the future. Still in the room where things were happening. She collected powerful men the same way that leaders collect talented musicians. She chose them deliberately. She understood their very specific vulnerability, and she gave them exactly what that vulnerability needed. George Shultz was Ronald Reagan's Secretary of State, and this was a man who had resigned from a previous government position rather than compromise his integrity. A man whose legacy was built on the idea that he was someone who did the right thing when it was difficult. So when his grandson, Tyler, brought him evidence that something was seriously wrong at Theranos, George Shultz sided with Holmes. The door that Holmes had knocked on with Shultz was a door marked legacy. The chance to be part of something that would change the world would be his final chapter of a remarkable life. Because George Shultz did have a remarkable life. Closing that door meant admitting that the judgment he'd staked his legacy on had been wrong, under sufficient threat to a deeply held self-concept. The evidence that contradicts it becomes harder to process than the evidence that confirms it. And you cannot really say that this is weakness because, that is the psychology of identity protection, and it's operating exactly as it always does. There was a structural exclusion of expertise of all of the 11 board members at Theranos' peak when it was needed the most. And that is because, not just because, but the main reason is not one had a background in clinical laboratory science, diagnostics, or the specific medical technology that Theranos claimed to have developed. Not one. This was not an oversight. It was a design choice. A board member with genuine expertise in blood diagnostics would have asked different questions, would have understood differently, would have understood what the technical claims actually meant, would have collected the data, would have been able to evaluate the gap between what Holmes was saying and what the science could not support. The board that Holmes assembled was extraordinarily powerful and almost entirely incapable of evaluating the specific thing that she was selling. Extraordinary, maximum credibility, minimal technical scrutiny. In fact, none. That combination was not accidental. It was designed. It was the architecture of a system designed to perform innovation rather than produce innovation. So some of you may be thinking, well, the board should have done proper due diligence. Hello? They bear responsibility too. And that would be absolutely correct. The board's failure of due diligence was real and consequential, and several members have faced significant criticism because of it and for it. Nothing in this analysis excuses that failure. What it adds is the psychological dimension that explains how extraordinary, accomplished, learned people make extraordinarily poor judgments not through stupidity or even corruption, but through the mechanism of targeted emotional capture combined with structural incapacity. Understanding how it happened is not the same as forgiving that it happened. I'm going to touch upon a topic that many people don't even bother to mention here, but I look at it a lot because I deal with a lot of bullying and harassment in my work. While Holmes was pitching the future to generals and secretaries of state, there were people in a laboratory in Palo Alto who knew that the machines did not work. They didn't suspect, they knew. And by late 2007, and this was documented in Caru's book, in his reporting, the scientific failures were already visible to anyone with the technical knowledge to read them. The Edison device was producing results that the scientists knew were unreliable, dangerous, absolutely dangerous. And the range of tests could actually perform a fraction of what Holmes was claiming publicly. For the tests it did run, the results were frequently inconsistent, frequently inaccurate, and in some cases, dangerously wrong. Patients were receiving results that were dangerously inaccurate and affected their medical decisions. The results were not reliable from a technology that did not work the way its creator claimed. And the people who knew this came to work every day. They processed the samples. They ran the tests. They documented the anomalies in the precise, careful language of scientists. And then they went home. And they came back the next day and did it again. How does that happen? The psychologist Albert Bandura spent decades studying how ordinary people come to participate in harmful systems without consciously deciding to do so. Now, there's a lot of pushback on some of his work, but he called the mechanism moral disengagement, the gradual deactivation of internal ethical standards through a series of small, individual, justifiable steps. I don't believe that anyone in Theranos decided on day one that they were going to fully deceive patients, that they would fully participate in fraudulent activity. That's not how it works. It never is. What happened was a series of smaller decisions, each one having a huge impact, and each one justifiable in isolation. It was the promise that could. Each one a little further from where they started, until one day they looked up and they realized they were somewhere they never intended to be, and saving face seemed more plausible. And the distance back felt impossible to cross. The first compromise was small, the result slightly outside the acceptable range, but close enough. An anomaly documented, but not escalated because the person above you had already seen it and said nothing. The second compromise was smaller still because The first one had already moved the line. And by the time compromises had accumulated into something any external agency would recognize as participation in serious harm, the internal architecture of each individual's moral framework had been so gradually restructured that what was happening felt less like a choice and more like the norm. This is a human story. I only tell human stories. I'm not interested in sensationalization. When I bring these deep dives in, they're human, and every person watching this who has ever stayed silent in a meeting where they knew something was wrong, who's ever documented a concern and watched it disappear into a system not designed to hear it, knows exactly what I am describing. The scale is different. The stakes are different. The mechanism is identical. So Theranos used non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, with an aggression that went far beyond standard corporate practice. Every employee signed one. And when people left, the NDA followed them out the door. Holmes employed David Boies, one of the most feared litigators in America, to enforce those agreements. The message to anyone who considered speaking was not subtle. We will destroy you. We have the resources to destroy you. But the NDA was not just a legal measure. It wasn't just a legal instrument. It was a psychological one. It was a means to shock. So when you cannot tell anyone what you know, you eventually begin to stop fully knowing it. You forget things. Convenient amnesia. The information has nowhere to go. It cannot be processed in conversation. It cannot be validated by another person's reaction. It cannot be integrated into your understanding of reality through the normal mechanisms of human sense-making. It sits inside you. It sits isolated inside of you, beginning to feel less like knowledge now and more like private anxiety, something that might be your misunderstanding, something that the people above you who seem so certain must have a reason for. The NDA did not just prevent employees from speaking externally. It changed how they spoke to themselves internally. That is psychological control at its most sophisticated.
You're listening to the Inquisitive Wren podcast, the show that brings you philosophical ponderings of your life from a bird's eye view. Now, here's your host, Sha.
I want to be very direct about something that most coverage of Theranos, well, the coverage I've seen, most of it softens or it avoids this topic entirely. Well, I've never seen anyone address this at all. At some point, and the documented timeline suggests that point came early. The people running Theranos knew that patients were receiving unreliable results and making medical decisions based on them. So they knew what was happening. The threat, the alert level, the safeguarding around it, they knew. And yet they continued. The legal system calls this fraud. The clinical system has a different word for it. What happened at Theranos was a safeguarding failure of the most serious kind, and I've been involved as an advocate with some very serious safeguarding issues. Real people, real medical decisions, real harm. In my work with toxic workplaces, with bullying, with harassment cases, with advocacy, I see a specific dynamic that I want to name here because I see it clearly in what Theranos became. There is a point in the arc of some toxic systems whereby the person at the top is no longer simply indifferent to the harm that they are causing. So they know the harm is being caused, they're causing the harm. They are aware of it. There is no doubt they are aware of it. And the awareness does not moderate the behavior. We see this in adult bullies. It may even amplify the behavior. The exercise of power over people who cannot fight back. The watching of people shrink. The deployment of legal threats against individuals with no resources to respond. The daily management of a system that suppresses people who are trying to do the right thing, ethically, morally, as a human being. Produces in some personalities not discomfort, not guilt, but something closer to satisfaction. That is the clinical line between difficult and dangerous, between a leader who cannot hear criticism and one who actively punishes it, between a company that fails and a company that harms. Theranos crossed that line. The evidence is in the trial record, in the testimony of the patients who were harmed, in the accounts of the employees who tried to speak and were legally shut down, threatened into silence. The idea was genius. What surrounded it was not. By the way, we do call this process and the issue that happened the Schadenfreude effect. Everything I have just described, the moral disengagement, the NDAs as psychological instruments, the system that makes speaking up feel impossible, the willingness, because it is a choice, to harm, to actively, consistently harm. I see versions of this in workplaces every week. If any of this feels familiar from your own experience, the Toxic Workplace Recovery Kit is in the description, but it's going to give you a language for what you've been living through. Those evenings, those weekends when you can't shut off, you cannot shut down because you know something's not right, that perhaps you yourself are being harmed. So the link is there when you're ready. I give you tools in order to help you move through it until you can make your next decision for your next step. Now, well, I believe that I've brought a different aspect here, psychologically, clinically, forensically, to the Theranos saga. I'm going to call it a saga because it's very sad, actually. Here is a question that people covering the Theranos story have not asked. They've not covered it, I believe, with seriousness. When the machines were not producing reliable results, when the data was coming back inconsistent, when the anomalies were being documented, why did no one apply the scientific method? By late 2007, The failures were already documentable. Theranos continued operating, they continued raising money, they continued making public claims for another 8 years. 8 years. 8 years of documented failure. And it was treated not as data, but as a threat. That timeline is not a scientific failure. It's an institutional choice made repeatedly by a system organized around protecting the performance rather than producing the substance. In a genuine scientific environment, the hypothesis is a proposition. You test it, it fails. You learn, you adjust, you test again. You live for the failure. It's an opportunity and it's data. So every significant advancement in history has been built on a foundation of documented failures that redirected the investigation towards truth. At Theranos, the hypothesis was an identity. Holmes had not proposed that blood testing could be revolutionized. That's not what she was proposing. She had declared it. She didn't propose it like you do in science, like you hypothesize. She didn't propose it. She declared it publicly to board members, to the media, to patients, to regulators. When the machines kept telling the truth, the organization was built to suppress. Treating that truth as data would have meant dismantling the identity that the entire enterprise was built on. So the data was not treated as data. It was treated as a threat. The scientists who produced it were managed, they were isolated, and removed. The documentation was suppressed. The external validators were kept at a carefully maintained distance for 10 years, while patients were harmed, while employees were silenced, while investors poured hundreds of millions of dollars into a performance of science rather than science itself. A safeguarding issue of the most serious kind. And one person's being touted as the whistleblower. But behind magazine covers and TED Talks and a validation of $9 billion at its peak, the whole idea was fraud. The idea was not wrong. It was genius. Testing a comprehensive range of biomarkers from a single drop of blood. That's a hypothesis that anyone could get behind. But if you could test it quickly, cheaply, accessibly, absolute genius. It's a genuine and significant medical need. Multiple companies are pursuing the technology right now, solving the technical challenges one by one. That's what they're doing. Doing the difficult, iterative, honest work of treating failure as data and data as direction. They are not there yet. Shows you how difficult it is. The challenges are real and significant, but they are being worked upon by people doing what Theranos refused to do. Saying it and meaning it are two different things. That technology eventually works, and it will work. It will. It will at someday it will. It will save the lives of children in the pictures on the walls of Elizabeth Holmes's childhood home. Theranos did not just harm patients and investors and employees. It set back the very technology that it claimed to champion. And that's a tragedy, because when a fraud performs an idea and collapses, it contaminates the idea in the public imagination along with everything else. People are already so skeptical of science because when a fraud performs an idea and collapses, it contaminates the idea in the public imagination along with everything else. People are always skeptical of science, of medical facilities. The idea, though, was genius. What surrounded it was its burial. Tyler Shultz was 22 years old when he joined Theranos in 2013. He was George Shultz's grandson. He believed in the mission. He believed in it. He did not last long, though, before he understood that something was wrong. He went to his grandfather, and George Shultz sided with Holmes. Tyler eventually went to the regulators. He cooperated with John Carrew's investigation at enormous personal and professional risk. Holmes, of course, deployed David Boies against him. His own grandfather, for a significant period, was on the other side. He stayed on the other side. Now, for me, every story of Tyler Shultz frames him or frames this story as one of great courage, great individual courage. A young man, doing the right thing against a conglomerate, against overwhelming pressure. That framing is not wrong, but I would say it's incomplete. Tyler's grandfather had his own history with principal departure from a sinking ship. So you see the threads here. There's been threads throughout my analysis. During the Nixon administration, George Shultz resigned his position as Treasury Secretary rather than to participate in what he saw as the weaponization of government agencies. He left on principle at professional costs. 3 months after he left, Nixon resigned. Tyler Shultz grew up in that family with that story, with that specific mythology of what principled people do when they find themselves on sinking ships. His ethics were real, and they were both also biological, biographical. Both things are true simultaneously. The courage was his own. The template was inherited. 2 young people and the same wreckage. There is one more connection here in the story that nobody's drawn publicly, and that is Elizabeth Holmes and Tyler Shultz moving in overlapping circles. Both came from families whose identity was bound up in institutional power. And what happens when that power collapses? So both grew up with the very specific weight of family legacy. And The expectation that someone needed to honor that or to restore it, to restore what had been built. Because George Shultz resigned, and Watergate was in itself one of the biggest scandals in American history. Holmes's father's world collapsed at Enron and drew one conclusion: build the performance more completely. Control every variable. Leave nothing to chance. Schultz carried his grandfather's example of what to do when you find yourself inside of a collapsing institution. And he drew another conclusion. Same wound, same world, opposite responses. One built a system to prevent the truth from being heard, and one held until it was. We began with two questions. What does a 9-year-old girl learn when she watches her father's world collapse overnight? And what does she decide to do about it 20 years later with $200 million and the health of thousands of patients? Now you know the answers. She learned that the performance of innovation can be worth more than the substance of it. She learned that power is captured through the precise targeting of powerful people's specific vulnerabilities. She learned that a system built tightly enough can suppress the truth for a very, very long time. And she decided, with all of that knowledge, to build that system, using her father's connections to fund it, his humanitarian language to justify it, his generational failure to inform it, her own formidable intelligence. She used it and performed everything with certainty to sustain it. And it worked. For 10 years, it worked. What it costs is documented in court records in John Carrew's extraordinary book, Bad Blood, and in testimonies of people who spent years living inside a system designed to prevent them from speaking. Again, the idea was genius. The execution was its burial. But here is what I want to leave you with. You do not need to have worked at Theranos to recognize what I've described to you today in detail. You just need to have been in a room where the data was telling the truth and the system around you was designed to make sure nobody could hear it, that nobody could tell it. That room exists everywhere. In hospitals, in law firms, yes, law firms, in schools, in creative agencies, and every organization that's ever prioritized the protection of its leadership over the safety of the people inside of it. Theranos did with more money, more lawyers, and higher stakes than most. But the architecture is the same. And once you can see the architecture, once you have the language for what you've been living inside, it becomes much harder for anyone to convince you that what you know is not what you know. That is what this episode was for. That's what this video was for. And if you've watched today and it's resonated with you in any way, if you recognized any of these patterns from your own experience, your own workplace, your own relationships, then the Toxic Workplace Recovery Kit, it's free. It's linked in the description and it was made for you if you're having difficulty regulating your sleep patterns, your emotions. If you're within a toxic workplace environment now, you need this kit. It will help you in the evenings. It will help you at weekends when it's your time. It will give you the framework, the language, and the tools to understand what you're dealing with and how to move through it. And if you want to go deeper even into the hidden dynamics of high-performing and highly dysfunctional groups, group dynamics, toxic workplaces, check out the next video on screen or that may come up in your feed. I will see you there.